Imagine a global economic powerhouse, a place whose manufactured goods were famous all across the world. Now picture that very same economy, just 200 years later, left absolutely crippled, impoverished, and stuck in place. This isn't some made-up story. It's the real story of the Indian economy under British colonial rule. So let's dig in and explore how this was so deliberately engineered.
See, before the British ever arrived, India was anything but a backwater. Actually, it was a major global player. Its manufacturing, especially in things like textiles and handicrafts, was known everywhere for its incredible quality and artistry. This wasn't just some local village industry. We're talking about a global brand.
And we can get super specific here. Just think of the Dakai muslin from Bengal. This stuff wasn't just cloth. It was basically a work of art. The very best version, called Mamal, was so fine it was legendary. So this is our starting point, right? A picture of a sophisticated, high-value economy. So what on earth happened?
Well, the big change started around 1757 and lasted for almost 200 years, right up to 1947. And this wasn't some random accident or a slow decline. No, it was the result of a deliberate, very systematic plan. You could call it a colonial blueprint, designed not for India's development, but for its total exploitation.
Okay, so to really understand this blueprint, we have to get the system itself, colonialism. At its core, it's a completely unequal relationship where the ruling country, in this case Britain, gets to set all the economic rules for the colony, India. And the number one rule was simple. Every single policy had to benefit the ruler. This one idea is the key to understanding everything that followed.
The British objective was, well, devastatingly simple, and it had two main parts. Step 1, take India's existing industries apart, piece by piece, and turn the country into nothing more than a supplier of cheap raw materials, like cotton and jute, for all the booming factories back in Britain. Step 2, turn India's huge population into a captive market, basically forcing them to buy the finished goods that were made in those same British factories. It was an incredibly effective and destructive strategy. So how did they actually pull this off? Let's break it down sector by sector and see the real impact these policies had on the ground.
All right, first up, agriculture. A staggering 85% of the Indian population relied on it to survive. This was the absolute backbone of the economy. But under British rule, this vital sector wasn't just ignored. It was actively pushed into a state of stagnation. That means it was barely growing at all, just stuck.
So how do you make an entire agricultural sector stagnate? Well, one of the key tools was the zamindari system. The British put local landlords, the zamindars, in charge of collecting taxes on the land. Now, the zamindars had to pay a fixed amount to the British, but they could keep whatever was left over. This created a terrible system where there was zero reason to invest in the land or improve farming. The only goal was to extract as much money as possible as quickly as possible.
And of course, the people who were actually doing the work, the farmers, the cultivators, they were the ones who suffered the most. They were squeezed for every last penny, left with almost nothing, and had no way to innovate. The wealth was literally being drained from the soil right under their feet.
The next major blow was something called the commercialization of agriculture. Farmers were pushed, and often outright forced, to stop growing food for their own communities, things like rice and wheat. Instead, they had to start growing cash crops, cotton, jute, sugarcane, the very things that fed the industrial machines in Britain. This put India's own food security at huge risk, all for the benefit of factories thousands of miles away.
So while all this was happening to agriculture, India's famous industrial sector was under its own assault. On one side, you had these world-famous, high-quality, handmade Indian products. And on the other side, a flood of cheaper, machine-made goods from Britain that, and this is the key, could be imported with zero taxes or tariffs. It was a competition that local artisans just could not win.
The result was exactly what the blueprint intended, a well-planned deindustrialization. India's traditional handicraft industries were just wiped out. And, crucially, the British made sure that no modern capital goods industries got started. Those are the industries that make the machines and tools for other factories. By preventing that, they guaranteed India would stay dependent on Britain for any industrial growth in the future.
Okay, next let's look at foreign trade, where Britain's control was just absolute. They set up what was basically a monopoly. More than half, think about that, more than half of India's entire foreign trade was restricted to Britain alone. Any access to a global market was choked off, making sure that all roads of commerce led right back to the colonial ruler. Now this leads to one of the most mind-bending parts of this whole story, the economic drain.
On paper, India actually had a large export surplus. It was exporting more than it was importing, which should make a country rich. But that wealth, that surplus, it never came back to India. Instead, it was siphoned off to pay for British government offices in London, to fund wars that Britain was fighting, and to cover all of their administrative costs. India's own profits were literally being used to pay for its own occupation.
These policies weren't just numbers on some ledger in London. They had a devastating, real-world impact on the lives of millions and millions of people. So let's take a moment to look at the human cost of all this.
The data is it's stark. The overall literacy rate was less than 16%, and for women, it was even worse, a shocking 7%. An entire population was being denied the most basic tool for progress, education.
With public health facilities being practically non-existent, the infant mortality rate was a horrifying 218 per thousand. That means more than 1 out of every 5 babies died before reaching their first birthday.
And if you did survive childhood, the average life expectancy was just 44 years. And that is a direct result of the widespread poverty, the malnutrition, and all the preventable diseases that were rampant.
And it's so important to remember that behind every single one of these statistics were real people. An entire population was trapped in this cycle of extreme poverty with a standard of living that was just abysmal by any measure you can think of.
So, when independence finally came in 1947, after 2 centuries of the systematic exploitation, what kind of economy was India left with? What did they inherit? Well, the inheritance was grim. You had a stagnant agricultural sector, a crippled industrial base that couldn't even build its own machines, poverty that was rampant and deeply rooted, and an infrastructure system, like the famous railways, that wasn't built to connect Indian people, but to drain resources out of the country more efficiently.
The challenge was just monumental. The country was finally free, but its economy was fundamentally broken, designed from the ground up to serve a master who is now gone. It leaves us with this huge, profound question. On the eve of independence, with an economy in complete ruins, where does a new nation even begin?